As we know it, Zimbabwe is aiming to secure an IMF-Staff monitored program by April 2024, with initial talks set for this month. Finance Minister Mthuli Ncube emphasized the program's focus on fiscal discipline and refining the exchange rate system. Now, this informal IMF agreement could pave the way for future financial arrangements. The nation has grappled with hyperinflation, hindering its access to international capital due to substantial arrears, including debts to the World Bank and African Development Bank. So this morning, Dr. Prosper Chitambara, a developmental economist, joins me from Harare, Zimbabwe, to shed more light on this. Doctor, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
So what is the significance of Zimbabwe's decision to enter into a new staff monitored program with the IMF? How might this impact the country's economic outlook?
Yeah, I think it's part of the country's re-engagement drive with the world, with the rest of the world, actually. And of course, as you know, the International Monetary Fund is an important part of the global financial and macroeconomic architecture. So I think this is very, very important. It helps the government to build a track record of implementing macroeconomic reforms, obviously with consensus from the International Monetary Fund. Of course, it's an informal arrangement, but I think it's still important and must be viewed, I think, from the broader perspective of our international re-engagement. And also as part of the high-level structured dialogue platform to deal with the arrears and the debt. I think this is an important element of that, especially under the macroeconomic reform agenda of that structured dialogue platform.
Yes, talking about the implementation of macro economic reforms, the Zimbabwean finance minister mentioned a focus on maintaining fiscal discipline, fine-tuning the exchange rate system, and a tight monetary policy. Now, you said that it is very important and it's very critical. Now, looking at these aspects, how do you think the government should go about this in stabilizing the country's economy?
I think so far we've seen a bit of some gains, especially around inflation reduction. So I think what the government needs to do basically is to continue to sustain the macroeconomic reform agenda, especially with respect to fiscal discipline. I know it's going to be maybe a bit challenging for the government to achieve that, given that we are now entering the agricultural season, the summer cropping season. And government obviously is going to have to dole out a bit of funds to support the farmers. And we have also seen the projections from the weather report, which are actually showing that Zimbabwe could actually be affected by the El Nino phenomenon this coming season. So that could obviously put a lot of pressure on public spending. But of course, government is committed to ensuring fiscal discipline going forward, and also monetary discipline. I think that has also been a major challenge, unsustainable growth in money supply. But of course, over and above the fiscal and monetary reforms, there are also critical governance and institutional reforms that government must implement, especially critical to restore confidence by investors, whether local investors or even foreign investors. So our institutions are in need of reforming, and I think that's very important if we are to ensure the restoration rather of confidence by economic agents.
Yes, now talking about hindrances. Now, Zimbabwe's access to long-term international capital is said to be blocked by its $14 billion debt owed to foreign lenders, that is including the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And as we know, it's nearly half of that debt is in arrears. Don't you think this could be a huge stumbling block for Zimbabwe in terms of the amount of debt it owes now, and when it comes to securing a deal with that international institution?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's a major stumbling block. And the National Monetary Fund has made it clear that the normalization, the full normalization of relations, especially when it comes to financial assistance will only happen once Zimbabwe has cleared its arrears with the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and the European Investment Bank. So I think so far what we can only benefit from our engagement with the International Monetary Fund is probably technical support or technical assistance. But any financial assistance is obviously based on our capacity or our ability to clear our arrears. I think that's why government has come up with this structured dialogue platform. It's an effort of trying to clear the arrears, which presents a significant bottleneck or risk in terms of our macroeconomy.
One other key challenge, Dr. Prosper, that is said to be dragging Zimbabwe back is the issue of hyperinflation, which is becoming unbearable for the citizens right now. So what are actually the real issues with dealing with inflation in the country? And are there other challenges that you would say constitute hindrances to Zimbabwe securing a deal with the IMF?
Yeah, so the issue of the inflation obviously is a major challenge. For the month of September, we've seen a drastic improvement, but I think it's also largely due to the change in the methodology that that Zimstat rather, is now using to calculate inflation. They are now using the geometric method. They've moved away from the arithmetic method. And the fact that Zimbabwe is now is highly dollarized means that the US dollar accounts for a greater weight in terms of the overall CPI. So the stability of the USD pricing is helped to moderate the hyperinflation with respect to Zim dollar transactions. So there's been a significant decline in the blended inflation rate for September to about 18.6% from about 77.2% in August. But there are still challenges. When you look at our pricing in Zimbabwe, and you compare with countries in the region, we are still, I think, one of the countries with the highest price levels when you compare in terms of purchasing power parity. So I think that points obviously to significant challenges with respect to competitiveness and also with respect to issues of productivity. So that's an area that, of course, traditionally, the major drivers of inflation in Zimbabwe are, number one, the money supply growth, unsustainable money supply growth, and of course, exchange rate developments. And of course, we've also been affected by external factors. We've seen the firming up of global oil prices of oil that also impacts adversely on Zimbabwe. But the two major drivers of inflation in Zimbabwe have been the unsustainable growth in money supply, as well as the depreciation of the Zimbabwe dollar on the foreign exchange markets. So if we're able to ensure fiscal discipline, control public spending, monetary discipline, control unsustainable growth in money supply, I think that obviously will lay a solid foundation for macroeconomic stability in the country going forward. It's very important because no country can actually sustainably grow and develop without ensuring price stability. So I think I would say that's the biggest challenge that we must grapple with. Even in terms of unlocking investment inflows, investors want to invest in an environment where there is a price stability, because that also assures them of maximizing their real return on investment. It also obviously minimizes uncertainties and even the risk of opportunistic and rent-seeking behaviors on account of the distortions that are created by the high inflationary environment.
Now, this now brings me to the next question, because we are taking a look at this IMF-Staff monitored program that has been advocated for by Zimbabwe, and it's said to be an informal agreement under which fund staff keep tabs on a member country's economic program. You've highlighted a couple of the programs that you feel that the government should implement. And if successful, it could lead to a financial arrangement in the future. Now, in some quarters, it has been said that Zimbabwe lacks the political will to impress IMF with its reforms, and that there are saboteurs within government who will always make it impossible for the country to achieve its economic goals. So how true is this? And what must the government do to ensure it takes on all sides for the fund?
So the issue of political will and commitment, of course, has been a challenge in the past. It's something that we must continually work on, because ultimately will and commitment is demonstrated by the willingness of policymakers to implement, especially the hard decisions around, say, the governance reforms, around the institutional reforms. So I think those reforms, obviously, they require a higher level, higher doses of political will and commitment. But some of the reforms may threaten certain vested interests. So obviously that then mean that we need more commitment, more will, especially from the politicians, from the policymakers, to see the full implementation of those necessary but very difficult reforms to implement. So institutional reforms by their nature, of course, not just in Zimbabwe, but across the world, they are always very difficult to implement because of the strong vested interests that may be staked against the implementation of those reforms. But of course, we have seen a bit of progress, but I think more can actually be done to demonstrate the will and commitment by implementing the right institutional and governance reforms that will also help to reduce the high country risk premium. So there's actually a high country risk premium that is actually associated and attached with doing business in Zimbabwe. So that also even means that even for the country to borrow money offshore on the international credit markets, it's very, very expensive. Even for Zimbabwean businesses also try to borrow offshore, it's expensive because of the high country risk premium. And that country risk premium can only be addressed through implementing these governance reforms and these institutional reforms.
Yes, now talking about high interest rates on funds being gotten offshore, let's look at the role of the IMF and the African Development Bank and other lending institutions. How would you describe what they've been able to do so far in helping African countries secure funds, and in terms of negotiations with creditors and the rates of these interest loans, the rates of these loans that are being provided for these African countries? Is there a possibility whereby we can see a reduction in the interest rate so that it would be kind of easy enough for these African countries to pay back when it is time?
Well, I think for me, the onus really must be on the African countries to address some of the challenges that have resulted in it being difficult for international creditors to actually lend money to African countries on terms that are favorable. When we look at the International Monetary Fund, for example, during the COVID era, we saw the International Monetary Fund actually providing about $33 billion in terms of emergency financing at zero interest rates. So I think that was actually a good move by the International Monetary Fund. But I think we need to do more as African countries to ensure that we address issues of corruption, for example, and some of the other institutional bottlenecks that actually conspire to make it more expensive for international creditors to lend money to Africa. And most of our African economies, we should actually not be relying on the International Monetary Fund or even the World Bank, because we actually have the resources. We have a huge diaspora. When you look at Zimbabwe, about 3 million Zimbabweans that are in the diaspora. We could actually issue diaspora bonds as one option of mobilizing resources at a cheaper rate than the average global interest rates. So I think there are a lot of options that we must fully explore as African economies in terms of mobilizing and harnessing resources domestically without necessarily having to rely on the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, unless, of course, there is an emergency like we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic era.
Yeah, Dr. Prosper, sorry. Now, earlier on, you talked about the need for the Zimbabwean government to implement policies, reforms that can boost investors' confidence and attract FDI into the country. But then we are looking at some other African economies like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, whose economy are said to though be struggling, but then are buoyant way beyond what Zimbabwe might offer to these investors. Now, when you look at Zimbabwe's economy, whether or not the government is able to implement its policies aright, do you think that it has that potential to attract the needed investments when you look at other stiff competitions with the leading economies on the continent?
I think that's we can't compete even with our regional neighbors. South Africa, you mentioned South Africa, even Zambia, Mozambique. I think that the doing business environment in Zimbabwe has been very challenging. Of course, we have advantages, especially relating to some of the natural resources that we actually have, lithium, gold. But I think for us to be able to unlock the full potential of our, in terms of our capacity to attract investments into the economy, we need to address the doing business environment, including things like the cost of finance. We actually have one of the highest interest rates in the world. Our bank policy rate is currently at 150% per annum, and I'm sure that's the highest actually in the world. So I think there are still a lot of challenges with respect to our investment environment, so many regulations and encumbrances, a lot of red tape in Indonesia. Of course, the government is trying to implement ease of doing business reforms, but I would think, I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that Zimbabwe offers a better deal compared with countries in the region like South Africa or even Zambia. When you look at our investment inflows, last year, 2022, we only attracted about 180 million USD worth of foreign direct investment inflows.
Okay.
When you compare with countries like South Africa, looking at about $5 billion, Zambia about $1 billion to $1.5 billion. So I think that goes to show that I think there's still a long way for us to go in terms of ensuring that our investment environment is more conducive for foreign direct investment inflow.
Well, I tell you that we will continue to monitor Zimbabwe's economic reforms and see how well it can liberate its economy. Dr. Prosper Chitambara, Developmental Economist from Harare, Zimbabwe, thank you so much for your profound contribution on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Zimbabwe currently struggles with high inflation, foreign currency shortages, a weak economy as we see it, and this latest government efforts are expected to help it access the needed help it can get from the IMF to further relieve the economic stress it is wallowing in. Now, only time will actually tell if these will be crucial to unlocking the much needed financial support it needs and rebuild investor confidence that has remained elusive for years. That is the end of Business Edge today. You can follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Don't forget to head on to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and equally download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store for different juicy stories that we have on those platforms. Until next time, I am Lekan on Onabanjo. Stay with us. The news will come your way at the top of the hour.